Might as well just get started here. We'll go through some club stuff and then I'll hand it over to you. Usually people put some questions and stuff in the chat as we go. So whatever you feel like doing, if you feel like answering them during the presentation or just waiting until after, whatever's up, whatever's most comfortable for you.
Sounds
Um,
good.
Sweet. Oh, Mike is here. How's it going, Mike? I don't know if you can hear me. That's all right. Well, welcome to the April 2023 meeting. Feels crazy that we're already past quarter one for 2023. This year's just been flying by with, everything at work and personal, and it's crazy. So, um, we had thunder snow here in Wisconsin last night, so that was really fun. So go figure, snowing and thunder and lightning. That was, of course, spring in Wisconsin. Um, if you guys want any special guests that you know of in the brewing industry that you're interested in possibly seeing on here, collaborating with the club, definitely let us know. We're not afraid to reach out and just get someone involved in it. So, absolutely let us know what you want to see with this club, whether that be a person or an activity, or shoot, even a group buy like the Tilt group buy that we're doing right now. If anyone's interested in a tilt hydrometer, the floating hydrometers that you can put in your fermenter and then read on your phone, kind of track fermentation, temperature, all that stuff. We have a pretty awesome group buy going on right now with the people at Tilt. The regular units, we're getting a 40% discount on them, and the Tilt Pros, we're getting a 33% discount. So I haven't seen anything nearly that low on those units out in the wild. So awesome chance to jump in and get some cool gear. More information on that, shoot me a message, let me know. We can chat. I can get you in touch with Trevor, who's kind of heading that up. Kind of on the same vein, one of the newer things that we introduced is the partnership with Master Homebrewers program. So I'm a part of that. I've been competing for a little over a year now in homebrewing, and this is just another way to push competing and homebrewing and getting better and trying new things. So this is a Learned Brewer exclusive, so if you're one of our paid members, you get a discount to sign up for the Master Homebrewers program, which of course gets you into that and gets you all the amenities with that too. So we got a cool program going on with them. Uh, Experiment series. We just had an awesome experiment about Pilsner Munich malt, trying to mix those to mimic Vienna malt, which I thought was really interesting. But if you guys are interested in doing a brew club experiment to get on the Brewlosophy website, hit us up. We're still doing the Delta Firm Tank giveaway for the end of the year for the most voted on experiment. So that's going to be a lot of fun. We just sent out 3 pouches of LO9 Que Bueno from Eben. He sent those over to us from Imperial, and all 3 recipients of those are going to be doing an experiment with that too. So you guys want some Lalaman yeast, you got an idea an experiment, and you want some yeast to go with it, let me know. I'll see what I can do. See if I can get you some sachets of that sent on over. Next month, with April and May right in a row, we're going to have a double header Imperial Yeast meeting. So we got Mr. Alex with us today, and we're going to have Casey from Imperial. I know Casey's been on the Brewlosophy podcast before, and I know Marshall chats about her every now and then. So we're going to have her on with one of her other colleagues to kind of just chat about yeast and her association with Brewlosophy and Imperial and all good stuff. So that's gonna be a lot of fun. Figured really get into the nitty gritty of yeast and our favorite microorganism with that. Um, Average brews today, of course, is April 1st, so it's the first day of Q2, which usually coincides with the real average brew release for the survey. Alex, of course, had to release other Alex, sorry, Imperial Alex, had to release his fun little survey results for the Purple Pilsner. If you haven't seen that, go check it out because it's pretty hilarious. A little callback to the New Zealand Pilsner episode of Rulosophy. But tomorrow I'll launch the real survey, so we'll get some leads in your guys' hands. We'll get a recipe put together for Belgian Saison. That's going to be a table saison we're going for right now, and I think it'll be really cool. Um, Learned Brewers have had access to that for about a week now, a little over. So they've got first dibs on yeast and getting involved in and kind of shaping the beginnings of that survey. So if you're interested in becoming a learner brewer, we got a ton of cool stuff that we're doing with that. Even I mean, we're growing that every single day. So definitely reach out. Let us know if you're interested, and we can we'll give you some info on that. Um, and one of those cool things is we're trying to do more merch. So we're doing some average brew glassware. We got our order in. I think I received a test glass this week to kind of approve the artwork. And we'll go from there. We'll get an order to my house, packed up, shipped out to anyone who wants those. And of course, learner brewers will get the first dibs on those, and they'll only be paying shipping for those, which is actually pretty reasonable. We did a lot of research trying to get as best shipping rates as we can. So we're gonna get those glasses to our learner brewers for a little under $5, which would be great. So that is all I have. Alex, floor is yours. How about you tell us a little bit about yourself, your brewing, your association with Imperial, and kind of the topics we're going to go over today.
Yeah, sure. So obviously, yeah, my name's Alex. I'm part of our technical team at Imperial. For those of you who aren't familiar, I'll give you a little background. I don't really want this to be a shill about Imperial, though. I'd rather just talk about yeast. We're located in Portland, Oregon, is where we're based. We have a location in Philadelphia as well that we opened a couple of years ago. For us, since we deal with commercial brewers a lot, it's really important to have locations on both sides of the country because we ship liquid yeast overnight and it's very heavy. So, anyways, we're bicoastal. Like I said, I'm part of the technical team. I mostly work with our research and development team, helping them with like a lot of the technical research. Kind of, if you think about like almost doing like reviews of subjects before we really get into them and stuff, and figuring out what the background knowledge is, and then doing my best to convey that as well to all of our customers, home brewers and professional brewers, in a way that's digestible, because not everybody gets paid to read scientific papers like I do, and so I figure if I can digest some of that and make it a little bit more accessible, that's a pretty cool aspect of my job. So anyway, that's what I do for the most part. As far as what we were going to talk about today, Haven, I know we had kind of talked about hitting on some hybrid yeast and talking about some other stuff, but I mean, like we were talking about as well, I want to leave this as open as possible. So we can start out by talking about hybrid yeast. I find that, instead of a presentation, I like to go through some stuff and then just have people interrupt me where they need, or fire questions as they come up. But at the same time, I don't think we're really. I'm not feeling like we need to be limited to any particular topic at all. I think hybrids is something that's interesting, but maybe like we were talking about Haven last time, doesn't have legs for a presentation that people aren't all that into. So I just want to make sure that y'all are into it if we're going to talk about it.
Yeah, you bet. And I think a really recent topic that'd be interesting to hear about from your side of things is the letting go of that organic label that you guys had as well. I think that'll
Yeah,
be kind of tie that in with the hybridization and kind of what that means for your Imperialis project.
totally. Yeah, that's happy to talk about whatever. So I guess, do you want to just I can start by kind of talking about what we do with hybrid yeast and kind of what hybrid is for us.
Go for it. Yeah, and everyone, if you guys wanna, if you have questions throughout the time Alex is talking, just shoot them in the chat or interrupt him. Like you said, we'll
Yeah.
keep it nice and loose and just kind of have a conversation.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of jump into it, and I'll apologize at the start. I'm not really sure kind of what the base knowledge level is in terms of yeast and yeast physiology, and particularly in regards to hybrids. So I'm going to cover some background that I hope won't bore you too much, and then if you want to get into it more, just let me know. But basically, like Haven had alluded to, we started as an organic company. We've recently dropped that organic certification, but the fact that we started as an organic company does play a significant role in why hybrids are something that we've kind of built a program looking into. Because of that certification, we have been and still are limited in terms of what we can do with genetic engineering or GMO technology. And that is really I mean, to be perfectly honest, that is the cutting edge, the leading research that's being done in the world of yeast in terms of coming up with new strains and pushing it forward. Hybridization is in the grand scheme of things also quite recent, but got overshadowed fairly quickly because it's um, a less precise method of getting in moving in the same direction. So, anyways, for us, that was what we had available to us in terms of being able to develop new yeast strains, because there are really kind of only two ways you can expand the selection of yeast that people have available to them, and one is creating new ones or bioprospecting. And bioprospecting, for anybody who's done that, is really hard. You can catch things really easily, but it's a really low percentage chance that you're going to get something that's actually going to hold up well in terms of a production brewing strain. So, anyways, we can't do the GE stuff, so we started getting into hybridization. So hybridization is basically yeast don't want to mate with each other normally; they just reproduce more of themselves. They just replicate, and hybridization is forcing them through one means or another to actually mate with each other. And so it's just like human beings when you have a kid. It's like it's your offspring. It's not necessarily half of one parent and half of another parent. It's not like a people sometimes get it confused with a blend of yeast, where you have two different strains that are blended together. This is actually like its own thing. It's a stable organism that has its own traits and characteristics and may show some relation to one parent or another, maybe one more than the other, but it is going to be its own thing. And so, what we're able to do through that process is kind of look for a yeast that is has traits that are more desirable is essentially what you're looking for. Something that think of it as like a palette of colors. You're just looking for more colors to fit on that palette. And so if you can find a yeast strain that maybe gets you certain characteristics that you got with another strain that wasn't very flocculent, and this one is more flocculent, that's something you can go for. Or you can go for something just new altogether, which for us, the first one we put out, I-22 Capri, is kind of fits that bill. It is a pretty good thiol releasing strain for something that is not genetically organized or genetically engineered, but it's not on the same level as any of the GE strains, to be very frank. But it is pretty good at that, and it's kind of been a fun thing to play with and get to know a little bit. But yeah, that's kind of, I mean, I could get into specifics more, but I don't want to just start going down rabbit holes unless people have questions. So that's kind of the baseline of what we do.
So if yeast don't usually like to reproduce with each other, I know they're usually
Mhm.
asexual. How do you, I mean, I guess for lack of a better term, force that?
Yeah, there are a couple ways you can do it, but most of the time it's putting them in an environment that it only where there's only a specific set of nutrients that are available, and it's generally like a stressed environment in the grand scheme of things, and it induces the yeast to and a lot of Marvin Gaye music, exactly. Um, yeah, so you're kind of starting to you're trying to push them to feel like some stress so that they have some sort of evolutionary need to actually replicate or do the things that it does to be able to replicate. But
Oh,
there are a couple other techniques, but that's kind of how we do it, growing under specific conditions in the presence of other yeast, and then they sporulate, and it's those spores that are going to allow them to breed.
interesting. Wow. So how long did it take to develop something that was actually usable? Is it kind of just a trial and error?
It's in the sense that you don't know exactly what you're going to get in terms of flavor production and fermentation behavior. It is a little bit trial and error. I mean, you basically once this starts and you have a whole range of possible strains to try. Whether you get like a couple successful mating events you start running these strains and you just see, okay, do they hold up? Basically, you're looking for the basic brewing characteristics at the start. Like, does it actually attenuate the wort? Does it not smell terrible? And then you go from there and see if it's really viable. So that part is a little bit guess and check. The the starting point, you can test yeast for how well it sporulates, basically, is a lot of the testing that we do. Some brewing yeast strains just don't sporulate very well, even under these perfect conditions. And so they're not good candidates for hybridization. Other strains do. And so we focus on those strains, and then we look at characteristics from those strains and kind of think about, okay, what would we theoretically like to pass on? But again, kind of going back to that metaphor, it's not like, we can always say, like, I'd really like it if my kid was 6'3". It's not as simple as just being like, okay, that's the partner that I need to choose for that. There's a little bit more randomization to it. So
What
Wow.
is the end goal of these modifications? Or is it better flocculation or better different temperature ranges that we could ferment at? What are different flavors? What's the end goal? Or what can
yeah, that's a great question. So for this first one, really our goal was we were trying to figure out if we could basically swim in the same pool as the people like Omega and Berkeley Yeast, who are making these thiolized or these genetically modified strains that release thiols, and are able to do some other biotransformative activity. We were trying to figure out if through this method we could improve that, in a non-genetically engineered strain. Obviously, that's what a lot of professional brewers and home brewers care about right now. And so, as much as we do like to explore our own projects, we are kind of, we have to pay attention to what people want. So that's what this one was geared towards. But yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there with taking a step back and thinking about what the possibilities are in general and what you'd like to be able to improve or target, or characteristics that are really sought after. Flocculation is a huge one, and that's one that is kind of this like boring mystery in the brewing world that we understand fairly well, but not completely, and we don't always understand. You know, if it works, it works, and then when it doesn't work, it's often really difficult to figure out why it didn't work. And so, yeah, that's one that a lot of people have talked about. If you could say, I don't know, I mean, I guess a good example would be like a really flocculent Kolsch strain or something like that. So you don't have to deal with like the powderiness that you get so often with those strains, or with other German ale strains where they can be like a little bit powdery. If you could just say, hey, you're going to run this at a coldish fermentation, and it's maybe going to take 7 days, but once it hits terminal, it's clear. It's like you don't have to worry about serving a hazy Kolsch or something like that. So yeah, um, that would be one of the top ones. I don't know that there's like a triage list that exists of further things we would target. Yeah, it's a good question. I think it depends a little bit on, it's a balance of what we're interested in, also kind of what the most realistic possibilities of having success are. Kind of have to, you can't swing for the fences every time.
So you would say you're fairly early on these modifications, and the possibilities are maybe endless eventually or something like that?
Yeah, I think it always depends on in what window you're looking at this through, like what time frame, I guess. And that's kind of where I said, it's in terms of what we've been able to do with brewer's yeast for as long as we've been dealing with it. Intentional hybridization is like really it's a pretty recent thing in the grand scheme of things. But because genetic engineering came on the scene, and with the advent of CRISPR became so much like more accessible, this kind of just got overshadowed. But yeah, I think as a community as a whole, we understand hybridization pretty well. There's been like a lot of good work going into the methods of hybridization, but in terms of like really being able to dial it in, it's I don't think it's anywhere near, say, where it is um for like plant hybridization or breeding plants or something like that, especially crop plants. Like it's for people who are doing that using non-genetic modification means, uh, growers are pretty good at that when you're talking about the plant world. In the yeast world, it's a much newer thing, and we're still learning a lot, both internally and as a whole.
That's awesome. Yeah, Ricky threw a question in the chat if you want to take a look.
Yeah, I was just reading that. Yeah, Ricky, that's a really good question. So, for those of you who aren't reading the chat, the question is basically about this hybrid strain that we make, I-22 Capri. Ricky's asking about the process in terms of product testing. So basically, if I'm understanding right, once we have it, how we decide what the practical uses are and how do we learn about it. And specifically, how do you figure out what kind of beer it works best in? So the last part, I can say we really try to not prescribe styles for strains that we have. There are obviously strains where you get it and it has either a certain lineage where it has historically been used in a certain way and it's going to perform well. But in general, we don't like to say this is a hazy IPA yeast as much as like A38 juice is what that is. It's also an English strain, and it was, the source for A38 juice, which is for those of you not familiar, is like our hazy IPA strain now. The source is Boddington's yeast, which anybody who's ever had a Boddington's, that's certainly not a hazy IPA. So with Capri, it's really the parents for Capri were A43 Loki, which is the Voss Kvike strain, and then A38 Juice, which is that London Ale 3 tranche of yeast section. And like I said, its origin is Boddington's. But given the characteristics of both of those strains, we had a pretty good idea that hazy IPAs would be a good candidate for it, or juicy IPAs, or kind of new world IPAs. And so when it came out, yeah, it did work well for that. It's a pretty good strain at promoting haze. So for those people who want to make a hazy IPA, they're not gonna be working against it. And then it's a lot of early on, it's a lot of in flask fermentations where you're just getting an idea of the esters that are produced and getting just a baseline of like, okay, what direction can we head with this? What fermentation temperatures does it seem to like and respond to best? And then we go into we have a 1 barrel kind of tank farm, 5 fermenters that we can just divert wort to, and we'll run trial fermentations in there with varying recipes, but often just getting a baseline. And then we have partners in the commercial brewing world who we rely on too. Once we get something like that, we're like, hey, you want to play around with something and get us your feedback? Because as much as we like beer, we have a really nice 1 barrel like farm that's really good for testing. But I guess I should have said this at the beginning. Most of us are former brewers. I didn't say that about myself as in the intro, but since we're former brewers, we're pretty aware that a 1 barrel fermentation is not the same as a 10, 20, 40, 200 barrel fermentation. And so instead of just going to market with this stuff and saying, hey, this is what it is, we'll often find people who say, hey, we have a really good idea of these characteristics, but we're still learning. Do you want to try this out? Let's find out what happens in your 40 barrel fermentation or something like that. And then obviously working with homebrewers as well to kind of say, hey, does this work at the homebrew level? And getting feedback there. So it's definitely a partnership with people that we work with.
Are you doing unhopped single malt wort for the testing internally and then kind of sending it to your commercial partners for actual recipes in that, or are you guys doing like a single hop blonde or something like that?
Yeah, no, most of it is unhopped wort. That's really we are, it's kind of interesting. Different yeast labs are set up to produce wort in different ways. And the way we're set up is really, it comes from definitely a lab informed background, which is to say that our wort is always going to be really sterile. But it maybe is not the best wort for making a beer that you're going to have full control over a lot of characteristics of the wort. And so yeah, it's a pretty baseline thing. And then we have lots of friends nearby in Portland, luckily, who are willing to kind of help us with the next steps. So
Awesome. And in terms with I-22 Capri, I know that's kind of a lot of people stick with the hazy, juicier IPAs with that. Do you know anyone, or have you guys internally done anything different with that? Have you gone like a, I know Voss doesn't really fit with that, but like a dark mild route or a tropical stout or something way off the cuff from what it's typically known for?
No, the short answer is just no. We haven't. It's we really like to experiment as much as we can, and there's just like once you get to a level, and we do a lot of experimentation in the lab. We do a lot of testing in flasks, but like I said, there's kind of this, we can run hundreds of fermentations in flask and get a really good idea of like the range of behaviors that you're going to see at different temperatures, different wort constituents, all this stuff. But we're pretty cautious about not taking too much from that and saying, okay, this is how it's going to behave in a brew. We think it gives us a nice baseline, but it what I'm getting at here is basically we don't get to a point where we're like, okay, well now we can make a wort that's going to work for a tropical stout, and let's try that, and then we're going to divert part of that and use it for something else, and we're just unfortunately not set up in that way. So
Okay, gotcha.
yeah.
Will Allwort asks, do you feel hybrid yeasts are superior to GE yeast strains, or just different means to an end?
Yeah, I don't think there's a superiority, and I always like to say this too, like, we started as an organic company not because of some philosophical stance that we had about organic versus non-organic, but it really was. I mean, we were based in Portland, Oregon, and there are a lot of organic breweries out there, and who just have a really hard time getting organic yeast. And for us, it was like, well, okay, let's see if we can help people out with that. And then from a process standpoint, it really wasn't. It just wasn't too difficult to keep it going that way and make everything organic. But no, so it's hybridization is what we are doing because it's what we had available to us. To be perfectly honest, genetic engineering is this is kind of like using a it's using genetic engineering is using a surgical tool, and hybridization is I don't know, using a good hammer. It's like it's not bad, it's just it's less precise, and like yeah, you can get the job done, but it um if I need surgery, I'm going to go to someone who has surgical tools. So yeah, I mean, to be perfectly honest, yeah, genetic engineering is um, much more targeted and much faster to get the results. It's also significantly more expensive, but um, yeah.
Awesome.
I just want to state for the record that I have no problems with hybrids and GMOs, but IPA beers can go to hell. So you could work on other beers, beer styles.
Totally. I mean, so this is I'm kind of curious. You mentioned tropical stout for like I-22. I would be interested to see kind of I-22 push back in the direction of kind of the Norwegian or Scandinavian farmhouse style beers and see how it performs in that environment. I don't know anybody who's kind of taken it in that direction. So
Yeah, I'd be really curious to see, especially with Voss being one of the parent strains that were a part of that. I know Voss is more probably one of the fruitier Kvike strains. So I don't know. Yeah, I'd like a Lithuanian farmhouse, a raw ale. I'm not sure. I think it'd be
yeah.
interesting, especially with the haze stability that it gives. That'd be cool.
So there's a question in here about sampling unhopped beer. Yeah, I should have clarified. Thankfully, now there are hop products that we can add that give some semblance of balance in the beer. But yeah, I mean, really, that kind of this is the point that I was getting at earlier. Is like we're pretty aware of the limitations that our sensory is going to be able to get based on our system setup, and that is really why we like work with brewers, because we'd rather taste a real beer that's made with this than wort that wasn't designed to be a beer mixed with some hot products to kind of mimic that. We can get a baseline from there, but until we have it brewed in a few real beers, we're pretty cautious about making any assumptions about how it's going to taste. So yeah, it's in general unhopped wort from that system doesn't taste very good. So but Anybody else have any other questions about hybridization, or y'all want to move on to other subjects?
Sorry, needed a refill there. Will Lovell says is GMO yeast a fad? Did you cover that one? I didn't hear.
Oh, I didn't even see that one. Oh wow, a bunch of these just popped up. No, GMO yeast is not a fad, if I had to guess. You know, I think we need, as an industry, I think in general, this is, you know, sorry, I'm gonna back up real quick. So I got my background is I was a cook for a long time. I got into home brewing just like y'all. Did that for a long time. I was like, well, I kind of want to do this. So I went back to school and got a degree in fermentation science from Oregon State University. And it's a pretty comprehensive food science, and part of that food science degree, and part of that is food law. And you get into, I got really fascinated by that. And the way that ties in here is basically our laws dictating how we have to disclose genetic engineered products or genetically modified products, or even define what those things are. I think in general, we just need to do a better job about communicating in the brewing industry what something is and what you're actually putting in your body. I don't have a stance one way or the other. I just think we need to be better about communicating it. So no, I don't think it's a fad. I do think that there's some potential for some unfortunately bad press coverage if, I don't know, something happened in the wrong way, which could just be completely, I don't know. I just really hope that doesn't happen, because it would really derail a lot of really good work that people are doing, I think. So no, I don't think it's a fad. I'm going to move on to this next one. If you could wave a magic wand. Oh man, oxygen. So okay, this one's about it. Basically, if I could, what variables to test if like we could set up some sort of trial amongst all these group members. Yeah, so the effects of oxygen on cell growth and flavor production is kind of my the thing that is probably always going to be my white whale. It is just such a complex and difficult subject to study because of a number of factors, but there's a lot of research that was done for a while, and then people just kind of like figured out how the basics work and stopped getting into testing a lot of the variables, partly because they are just so difficult to control, in particular like getting certain saturation levels of oxygen in wort, and then being able to measure how quickly the yeast take that oxygen up, and how efficiently they take that up, and how that affects them. That would be something that I think is the root of a lot of home brewing and commercial brewing issues and causes of unknown flavor effects for people. And I think if there's a lot we could learn about that process that would really be beneficial for the whole brewing community to kind of understand what they're doing when they're brewing, what the oxygen is doing for the yeast and their beer, and kind of how to I kind of like in my mind, I think of like, you know, a brewer sitting at this control panel of like all these things, all these knobs and dials that they're always turning. To me, oxygen is like this whole separate control panel that just has been like walled off, that we like, and a switch has been put on the outside, and we basically just have it on or off. And it's like, I think we could, yeah, as you can tell, I am obviously excited about this subject. So yeah, that would be the one. I'm curious if any of y'all have ever played around with oxygen, actually, like, or any experiments.
I had some questions about oxygen, but I may go down a rabbit hole, and you may go on for 5 hours. So maybe it's not a good topic. But actually, one question I did have on oxygen is that I don't have a cooling wort system, so I'm thinking about just doing a long-term cool down. And I just read about if you oxygenate the wort, it doesn't last that long, or doesn't hold the oxygen. You have to put the yeast in within an hour or two. What's your feelings? What's your feedback on that?
Yeah, so that's you. Yeah, you bring up a really good point there. So just in general, when you're thinking about this, basically, if you let's say your work that is just sitting at room temperature, it's open to ambient air, and let's pretend that you can leave it there and it's not going to get infected or get anything into it, and you can just leave it there as long as you want. Um, Over time, it's going basically the partial pressure of all the gases in the air are going to be exerted on there, and you're going to get gas in solution that is going to be roughly equivalent to the balance of gases that are in the air. Um, I hope this isn't getting too much, but this is how I think about it. In the air, oxygen makes up about 21%. I think it's like 20.95% of the air that we breathe. Um, and what that equates to is when that comes into equilibrium with all the gas in your wort, you have about 8 to 9 parts per million of oxygen in your wort. That's like comfortable. That's going to stay there. It's not going to disappear into the air because you've also got the oxygen in the air that's like this equally exerted pressure. So that is at equilibrium and that would be stable. So in the situation that you're talking about, let's say you had your pure oxygen wand that you're running from like an oxygen tank and you oxygenate your wort, you're going to get that above 8 to 9 parts per million. That's probably going to get like saturation point, depending on temperature and work gravity, is going to be somewhere around 35 to 40 parts per million. You probably won't get that using a wand on a homebrew system. You generally will only get that if you're doing that in line and running your wort over that. But put your wand in there, you move it around, you're probably going to get to like 18 to 20 parts per million. And that's where it's going to be. But as that wort sits, as you're waiting for it to cool down, since there is more oxygen that's been forced into there than there is a partial pressure of oxygen in the ambient environment, it's going to start slowly escaping out and coming to that equilibrium of 8 to 9 parts per million, which fortunately is enough oxygen for the vast majority of brewing strains. There are some strains that like it like a little bit more oxygen. Some Belgian strains that are particularly top cropping seem to be more oxygen hungry, and then London Ale 3 strains like A38 juice are pretty oxygen needy as well, and typically would not perform as well if they were then pitched into that wort that has been coming to room temperature. But that's kind of how I would think about oxygen. You're not going to lose all the oxygen in there. You'll have some if it's been oxygenated already, but it probably won't be at a very high level. It'll probably be okay to brew with, especially if you have good, healthy, fresh yeast. But if you have yeast that's maybe like towards the end of its life cycle and isn't doing so hot, that might be a problem then. That might not be enough oxygen to really get that yeast back and in a position where it can make a lot of new yeast cells. I think would be the easiest way to say that.
How long does that equalization process happen? Like,
Oh,
say Daniel would oxygenate and then let it just cool to ambient temperatures. Would it equalize before? Is that just a moot point for him oxygenating before?
I don't think it. I don't think it is. I think it's better to oxygenate before because basically it's going to be it's going to take quite a while. Like we're talking probably on the scale of days, weeks, maybe for an unoxygenated wort to just sit. If you just like aren't agitating it and you just took it and you set it on the counter, for it to get 8 to 9 parts per million of oxygen, you're talking days. Like it's if you're not agitating it and getting in there, like there's not a lot of gas exchange that's going on. But if you over oxygenate your wort, say you're knocking it out, it's hot, you just get as much oxygen in there as you can. That's probably going to come to equilibrium, and you're just going to be there. So whenever your wort is cool, it'll be ready to go. If that makes sense.
Hey, Alex.
Yeah.
In regards to oxygenation, when I first started brewing, a buddy of mine who's much better at this than I am told me I should set up a oxygen stone and then do it in line. And when I did it with mostly dry yeast, because that's what I was brewing with, am still, all I noticed is that it increased the lag time sometimes by a full 24 hours. But every time I read something, talked to someone, everyone said that the oxygenated wort should go faster, and mine always went slower, which I think is because it spent more time in lag building cell walls. But
Yeah, it's always hard to speculate exactly what is going on, but I think you're spot on kind of in how you're thinking about this. In that situation, if you have new kind of fresh-ish yeast, let's just call it, since it's dry, let's call it fresh. Um, that's not a dig at dry yeast. I want to be clear. It's just a different metabolic state. But if you're putting healthy yeast into a fermentation and you see a super long lag phase, more often than not, that's the result of over oxygenation. And just like you're thinking about, it basically just has a ton of oxygen that it's going to take up. It actually is going to take it up really quickly. Like if you're using liquid yeast, I can only speak for liquid yeast. I'm not sure about how long the process is for dry yeast to rehydrate and then be at a point where it can uptake oxygen. But usually if you're putting liquid yeast or rehydrated slurry into there, it's going to uptake all the oxygen in solution within like 90 to 120 minutes. But then it has to start using all that oxygen to build its unsaturated fatty acids and lipids to first kind of maintain and expand its cell wall. Because basically cells start at a size, they grow, and then once they get to a certain point, that's when they break off. And it's like if a cell is this big, the two resultant cells are going to be this. So all it's doing is just the more cell wall it can build, the more new cells it's going to make, and the better maintained its individual cell walls are. So if you give it a ton of oxygen, it's going to take it all up. And then, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it just is a longer period of time where it's just kind of like doing this thing before they're like, all right, now let's eat.
so with that said, is there a like at my scale, is there a downside to over oxygenating? Because an oxygen stone puts a ton of, especially since I'm using a counterflow chiller, so that the flow rate of the wort is very slow. And so I even when I set that oxygen down to the point where it's just putting bubbles in it, it's a ton of oxygen. So if I was to do an experiment down the road without, how do I make sure I don't over oxygenate to sabotage the experiment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the only real answer is you get a dissolved oxygen probe, which is unfortunate because those cost about $500 to $600.
Pass.
But that is, yeah, right, exactly. So I actually, can I share my screen?
You should be able to, right? In the middle, there's
see if
an
I
open share.
Oh yeah, okay. Let me see if I can do this because we have a beta version of a calculator for dissolved oxygen in your wort that I can show you guys. I've never actually tried it for homebrew stuff. Let me find it here real quick.
Yeah.
Okay, let's try this. Oh, I might be biting off more than I can chew here. Sorry.
Nope, no problem.
So with that said, how do we at our scale solve your magic wand and do oxygen if we can't tell you what the oxygen level is?
So basically you have three options at the homebrew level. You have no oxygenation, zero oxygen in there. That's basically you've boiled your wort, you just run it into your carboy, your fermenter, whatever, and you don't aerate, you don't splash, you don't do anything. That's not ideal, but that's an option. You can target it, you can hit that variable. That's 0 parts per million. You can either splash and aerate.
So are you submerging the as you're transferring? Are you like submerging it and so that it's filling from the bottom up as opposed to?
I'm sorry, can you expand on that?
So in order to have no splash, you almost need to once you get like 3 inches of, put the hose inside the wort so it feels like almost like you're filling a bottle.
Yep. Yeah. So that you would do that. And that's basically like the only reason I bring that up is not to try it, but that would just be like a variable. You can get to that variable. You either fill from the bottom of your fermenter, you have like little agitation as possible, just like letting it rise up almost. Or you have a conical fermenter, you're filling from the bottom already or something. You then have the method, kind of like Daniel was talking about, where basically like you would intentionally just like oxygenate the heck out of it, or over oxygenate it, and then just let it sit for a long enough period of time where you can say, okay, I'm pretty sure that this is going to have kind of that amount of oxygen in there that's at equilibrium with ambient air, so like 8 to 9 parts per million. So you've got, let's say, 0, 9 parts per million, or the one where you basically just stick that wand in there, run in that O2, like really pretty, I mean, a liter per minute is significant for the amount of work we're talking about. You run that for like 5-10 minutes, and you're probably going to be at 25, 27 parts per million. And so you've kind of got like high oxygenation, middle oxygenation, and no oxygenation. But to answer your question, that's kind of the control you have, unless you are able to calculate the flow rate of your oxygen and the flow rate of your wort, which is what I was going to show in this calculator if I can, and run all these calculations for the density of the wort, the temperature of the wort, bunch of physics stuff, and then say, okay, now it has this parts per million of oxygen.
Do you have that calculator? Because I know the temperature. I can tell you the flow rate because it takes 20 minutes to move 5 gallons. So I can time it. I can set how long I want the oxygen to run into it. But I can't control if the dial is just, it's like it's on a little, it's on a lot. There's not much.
Am I presenting anything to y'all? Can you see anything right now?
We see it.
Okay. Let me see how. Are you seeing, like, is it a spreadsheet?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm just gonna move over to that because. Anyways, so this is, like I said, this is a beta version, but basically you can see here. Can you see this when I move?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So we've got your knockout volume and your knockout time, which these just go together to basically figure out the flow rate coming out of your fermenter. So let's say, I think Haven, you said you had a 10 gallons, so we'll say like a 0.33 barrels. Let's see, Haven, how long does it take you to knock out?
Get it down to pitching temp.
Yeah. Or I guess the actual period of time, or do you have a chiller that you're running it through?
I do, yeah. I run it with an immersion chiller, so I mean, knockout is a click of a button. Down to chilling time, 10 minutes.
Okay.
Down to
So
pitching.
we'll say,
Alex, I'm using a counterflow if you want to use that, and I know my numbers.
sure, yeah, let's do that.
It's 5 gallons, and it's about 20 minutes to knock out, and that goes straight to the it's 6 gallon transfer, I should say.
I'm gonna hope my math holds up here. All right, sorry. How long is your knockout time?
20 minutes.
So it's 20 minutes. I can already tell you are definitely over oxygenating your wort. It doesn't really matter what flow rate you're running at. That is just like that's so much contact time with the oxygen stone. This is kind of the great thing about using them at the homebrew level. What's like a typical starting gravity?
1048, 1052.
Okay, so we'll say, yeah, like let's say 13 Plato.
Transfer temperature is Fahrenheit 60. Well, it's 20 C, so that's
perfect.
68.
Yeah, 68. So if do you know the flow rate you're running your oxygen at?
As low as possible when I do it. And what I've done more recently is I'll just do it for like 5 minutes of the transfer. I won't do it for the entire.
Do you have a flow meter on there that says liters per minute that it's flowing at?
No. I just look at the bubbles. If it's gotcha. mostly bubbles, then it's too much. And if it's just a light layer of bubbles on top, then I feel like that's kind of right.
Sure. So this is basically what you can see from here is unless you know so this is saying if your target DO level was 20 parts per million, you'd want to run this at 0.1 to 0.2 liters per minute, which if you've ever ran that before, is very little oxygen, even if you're just knocking out for 5 minutes. Is this making sense to everybody too? Is this clear kind of what variables is taken into account here? I know this is a bit of a rabbit hole.
Yeah. I mean,
okay.
I guess the question is, if I just ran it for like 1 minute, 5 minutes, would I be able to dial that in that way and using your calculator to say, okay, well, I'm not going to run it the whole time, but I'm going to run it hot for a few minutes, for like 1 minute or 2 minutes.
Until you can quantify the flow rate that you're flowing your oxygen at, there wouldn't be a way to quantify it now. So those things, it depends if you, they're not that expensive. I think you can find them for like $50. That it depends on your oxygen tank, but you can get a flow meter. They're called rotometers sometimes. And you can get them for different levels, but you can get one that's like 0 to 1 liters per minute, and you'll be able to dial that in within there. But I want to be very clear too. I've never tested this. We've tested this in production settings, and it's fairly accurate. I've never tested this calculator at a homebrew level, and it's kind of one of those things where it's like when you get to the edges of its I don't know, the area in which it's supposed to work, I start to have questions about how its accuracy. I'm wondering if this would be getting too low, and it's making too many assumptions just based on the math that's in there. Anyways, I'm going to stop sharing this.
Testing a variable, would over oxygenating and then splashing be two variables that you can easily say this is too much and this is splashing, and see what the impact is?
I think you could have with pretty good confidence. You could say I'm in like the 25 to 30 parts per million at that over oxygenation, and I'm in the 8 to 10 parts per million in the splashing range. If you wanted to test those variables, I think with pretty good confidence you could do that. But it'd really be the type of thing. It'd be like I'd find a brewery in your area who seem nice and just be like, hey, do you guys have like a dissolved oxygen probe that I could do for this test I'm running? And I don't know, see if they'll help you.
So I would just take them a sample?
No, so you wouldn't be. That's the problem, is you need the probe there because the oxygen will come out of solution so quickly. Yeah, there was a reason I said like this is why this is my white whale. I'm pretty sure this will just forever be a thing. Is it is really difficult to test this stuff. I mean, it is, oxygen in solution is fleeting, and it's difficult to measure. So anyways, there are some more questions here that I want to get to. I know we kind of just went down a bit of a rabbit hole there. So Ben mentioned, how do you select the initial parent strains? At what point do you try and swap out different parents to achieve? Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of, like I mentioned, the selection for parent strains has to do with, first of all, a strain's physiological ability or like propensity for being good at hybridization, which basically is sporulation. And so we ran tests on all of our strains for that, so we kind of have an idea of if they can or if they can't. And then once we get a hybrid, swapping out parents is difficult. It's kind of like if you find two that mate well together and produce an offspring that is stable and a quality like contender for brewing, that's a positive step, but it's a very big process to start over with one of those strains and a different strains. Success with those two strains does not mean you're going to have success with two other similar strains. So this is kind of where going back to really, I think hybridization is a really cool tool. And personally, like I love a lot of the, trying to think of the right way to say this, kind of the societal and cultural connections that yeast has, and kind of, I mean, really looking at kind of a lot of what we're learning about Kvike yeast, and recently I think it's really brought it to the forefront how important yeast